Can you imagine how hard it was for Mary and Joseph? They were engaged, but before they had consummated their marriage, Joseph found out that his betrothed, Mary, was pregnant. And when he learned of this, he decided to break off the engagement. He wanted to do it quietly. He didn't want to do anything to sort of upset her or... Hey, wow, that was me a few seconds ago. I think that's the live stream. Is it coming through? Working? Okay, you were watching. I didn't lose my train of thought at all. We're right with Mary and Joseph, and Joseph was breaking it off, and no. Okay, we're still all here. We're all fully present with one another in this space right now. Some of you got that. You know, it made sense, though, if you think about where Joseph's coming from. He hears about this news. It's natural for him to want to break things off. He knew that he was going to be disgraced too, because word of this was going to get around. And if we try to put ourselves in that scene, we can imagine him having doubts about the Father. Claiming the Holy Spirit in procreation seems unlikely at best as an explanation. And we can wonder what life would be like for Mary. She would have this baby. She'd be a single mother at a time when the shame would probably ruin what was left of her life. She was a teenager, so she'd also be a teenage single mother. The odds were stacked against her, and of course, like I said a second ago, we're going to come back to her on Tuesday night. But right now, what about Joseph? An angel appeared to him in a dream and assured him that God was at work bringing Jesus into the world. The way Matthew unfolds is designed to establish Jesus' credentials. It's about building a case so that Matthew's original audience would have no question about who Jesus is or what he is capable of doing. For Joseph, this story is one of trust. Trusting that God's love is present even when we don't see it, or when all of the evidence that surrounds us seems to contradict it. It's about hope for the future. It's about finding joy even when these circumstances change. Joseph is one of those biblical characters who struggled. The Bible doesn't say that explicitly, but when we read the story, we see him trying to figure out what's next. What do I do in this situation? How do I respond to an unexpected twist in his life, or in this life? He thought things were going to go one way, and then there was this turn. The struggle wasn't as extreme as Mary's. However, for us to treat all of the characters in the Christmas story, we can't ignore him or what he was going through. None of the Gospels mention Joseph in Jesus' adult life. Mark doesn't mention him at all. Luke has him a little bit in the birth. But mostly what we see is his name as trying to situate who Jesus is. And Luke 4 refers to Jesus as Joseph's son. You know, son of Joseph the carpenter. John 6 makes a similar reference. And in both cases, it's sort of when people are trying to figure out what to do with Jesus. In Luke, it's when they're about to run him out of Nazareth. So if we're going to try to understand Joseph, we're really dependent on Matthew. The early church was quite creative in trying to make sense of Joseph. Some traditions, they added a lot. Some traditions held that he was an elderly widower before he ever even met Mary. So Jesus' brothers and sisters, who were referenced in places like Mark 6:3, must have really been his cousins, because Joseph was way too old, thus adding to the miracle of Jesus' birth. Other traditions started to portray him as this saintly ascetic. But in either case, there's no historical or biblical support for these kinds of views. What we have in Matthew is a story trying to convey who Jesus is. What we see in Matthew's Joseph is a person who suspended his disbelief to put his faith in God. Joseph kept moving forward. He kept trusting. Sometimes in our faith journey, sometimes in our journey of life, we have to just keep moving forward, even when it's hard. We experience setbacks. We experience tragedies. We experience times of worry, times of doubt. We can have wins and we can have losses. We can have highs and we can have lows. For Joseph, the road seemed to be at a dead end. In his mind, the thought probably echoed, my soon-to-be spouse is now pregnant. I gotta get out of this. Might he have rejected the angel the same way Ebenezer Scrooge dismissed the first ghost in the Christmas Carol? Joseph might not have believed he was seeing an angel, and the angel could have said back to him, you see me, why do you doubt your senses? Joseph could have foreshadowed Dickens' words and say, because a little thing can affect the senses, a slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be a bit of undigested beef, a blot of mustard, or a crumb of cheese. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. I can see an angel at that point shrugging, saying, really? You don't even believe seeing me? But Joseph didn't say that. According to Matthew, he believed the angel. And when he did, and when he trusted, and when he had faith, and he moved forward in that faith, he experienced peace. So how do we keep going in faith when life's difficult? Sometimes it's easier with these biblical examples because we can read them in the pages of a Bible, with the gold binding and a heavy leather cover, and say, well, obviously they got it right. What about us today? Sometimes it's easier with a contemporary example. And fortunately, we have lots of those. And that's where the other Joe comes into this story. In 1985, two British climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, were trying to climb a peak in the Andes that no one had ever climbed. It was really remote, 21,000 feet high, snow-covered, and very difficult to access. The climb itself was incredibly hard, but they did it. And as they were coming back down, Joe Simpson fell. Even though he was attached to his climbing buddy, he fell, and when he fell, he broke his leg. He didn't fall to his death because of the line, but he did break his leg. So now Simon had to lower him down. And in a series of heroic drops, he'd lower Joe, climb down, lower Joe again, climb down. The climb took longer to get to the peak than they anticipated. And so as they were going down, they were running short on food and supplies. And then the weather changed and came in. And at one point, Simon began to slip as he was lowering Joe. And he got to the point where he was slipping over a ledge and Joe fell into a crevasse. Simon knew at this point Joe must be dead. But he couldn't hold the dead weight of Joe suspended in the crevasse, and his feet were slipping in the snow, and he had no choice because it was either both of them or he leave Joe behind. And so he cut the rope. Simon finished his descent and reached their base camp, and when he did, he was racked with grief. He was surrounded in the sense of guilt over abandoning his friend. Meanwhile, deep in the crevasse, Joe, who had been suspended and then dropped onto a ledge, was laying there. And Joe pulled the rope to him, looked up, he could see in the top, the crack where he had fallen in, and he could see some light in the blizzard outside. With the broken leg and some more broken bones now from the fall, he knew he couldn't climb back out. And so he climbed down. He decided in that moment that I'm going to die anyway. I might as well die trying. And so he went down hoping the crevasse would open up because they were coming down the mountain. And it did. With a broken leg, he crawled the 6 miles back to their base camp and barely caught Simon, because after Simon reached the base camp, he was getting ready to leave. He went 3 days as he crawled out with no food and no water. It was an amazing story of survival, amazing story of continuing even in the face of insurmountable odds. Joe wrote about it in his book, Touching the Void, and his extraordinary survival started when he decided to keep going. And we can be inspired by his story, but we can also learn it's worth continuing as long as we have breath in our lungs. Joseph in the Bible went out on a limb. He trusted God's messenger about Mary. He proceeded to marry her and provided an example for us to follow. Matthew shows Jesus' birth as a culmination of everything. God entering the world instead of something different. Emmanuel, God with us, the baby of this manger, comes into the world through ordinary, mixed up people who struggled, people who had problems, people who faced big decisions, people who wrestled with these decisions, trying to figure out what to do. People like us. What does it look like to try? What does it look like to keep going? To come to an apparent dead end and say, you know what? I think the angel is telling the truth. I think that God is still God. And I can move forward in faith. One of my favorite songs is by Buddy Rich. Well, it's recorded and made famous by the Buddy Rich Big Band. It was written by Sammy Nestico, and it's called You Gotta Try. And it's an instrumental. And so when I hear instrumentals, especially some of these jazz pieces, a lot of times what I like to do is try to interpret them. And for me, it's often a theological interpretation. I like to try to figure out what could God be saying in this. I don't know if Buddy Rich asked that same question. I'm not going to pursue that. But in 1978 at the North Sea Jazz Festival, the Buddy Rich Big Band opened their set with this song, You Gotta Try. And Buddy counts it in and then begins on the drums, and the bass joins him, and then the piano. And the intro is a full minute of the bass, the piano, and the drums. I've listened to it many times. Tom Warrington on the bass and Bob Cade joins on the piano, and the jazz modes, the riffs, the string of notes coming together are just amazing. And all three of these instruments are going very fast. And it's almost like as Buddy's counting it in on his hi-hat, he says, let's go for it. Let's do this. You gotta try. In our faith journeys, we have opportunities to go for it. To be down in the crevasse and to not give up. We have opportunities to trust God and to know that God is with us. At about a minute into the song, the horns come in, and we, the listeners, get the full impact of the big band. In life, we go. We trust. We hope. And sometimes we get to see, if we open our eyes, instances of God with us. For me, when the full band comes in, I experience God again. And remember that Joseph was able to be part of God in the flesh. It's not just in biblical times, because miracles still happen. Joe Simpson lived through that horrible climbing accident, in part because he kept trying. On this journey, we're not alone. Because of that baby in that little stable down there, symbolized here in front of us, whatever we go through, no matter what we go through, we can have full faith that the full band of heavenly angels will be there, and they're not going to leave us hanging. God is with us. Amen.